how will people hear it? Will it be like a radio show? You've heard of the famous ones, but it was never done in India. So I was wondering, who was going to hear it and what was going to happen with it. And we sort of just we said fine. I think our first season was just like a pilot season. They gave us no money. We got nothing from it. We just did it like to see if there was an audience. And somehow, I think Savan specifically also, Savan has a very wide reach in the interiors of India as well. And I do it with a co-host called Ankit Vengurlekar, who's also a RJ and stuff like that. So Ankit and I talk in Hindi, English in that way. And I think we're very relatable because we've been good friends for a while, so we have no filter. And we used to just talk about, in the beginning, the first 12 episodes were just about our lives and our relationships. And, we picked up like, okay, can you just be, I think our first episode was, can a boy and girl just be friends? And because we were two friends doing it, we were like, we're a boy and girl and we're just friends. And is it possible? It was something that everybody talks about, right? So I think it connected with people, and I just took off from there. So I never really, now people say, oh, you're the OG of podcasts. And I'm like, I didn't even know what I was doing when we started. It was just like, okay, we are just going to do this. And we had 2 years on Savan, and then Spotify signed us on as a Spotify original, because the person who I knew at Savan also shifted to Spotify. And I think Spotify is for most podcasters, Spotify is like, it is the holy grail of podcasting, I guess. Yeah, you hear of podcasts on Spotify. So we were very lucky that way, and we're now in our fourth season. That means, and here every season is 24 episodes. So we've done a lot of episodes. And the good thing about love and relationships is you can never talk enough about them, and they change. The dynamics of love and relationships changes with months and years. So you can keep talking about the same thing another year, and something would have happened in dating or in any kind of those relationships. So yeah, it's been a great ride. And now, yeah, we're just trying to up the content, and that's what we're doing with Love Aaj Kal right now.
That's great. And I really agree with what you said about, you can always talk about relationships. And I feel like both of you, in that sense, have chosen themes or topics where you can keep having conversations, whether
Yeah,
it's stories or whether it's just like sort of conversations around it, which are
yeah,
endless, and they
yeah.
never uh, become irrelevant or go out of sort of people's minds,
Style,
right?
yeah, go
Yeah,
out of fashion.
exactly.
Love
Yeah.
never goes out of fashion, and so does like horror stories. That's like one of my favorite genres of all time. So I watch horror to relax. So so yeah, it never goes out of style. Yeah.
Me too, actually. I love listening to horror podcasts before I go to sleep because I find horror super
Yeah,
relaxing.
yeah,
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
not at all.
But Meeta, I would love to know your perspective on podcasts, and because you also have your own journey with storytelling and with writing and books.
Oh, well, I have really nothing much to add to. It's fascinating to hear both your stories, Nikesh and Astha. It's amazing. Nikesh, I do have a question for you connected with publishing, which kind of hurt me. But I think we are a civilization which is based on oral storytelling, and podcasts are a listening experience. And there is this theory by David Kolb about how learning happens differently for different people. So how different people absorb information that is let out differently. And the same theory, I feel, is now playing out in the virtual world. And it remains as relevant to the virtual world as it remains relevant to the real world. Because all of us are absorbing content differently. And podcasts, I know, I can imagine what Astha is talking about, but I think it's one of the most fascinating mediums as a listening experience. Because listen, guys, we grew up on listening to radio. That was our form of audio entertainment at that time. When our generation was growing up, we didn't have television. So I feel it's in a way, if you basically deconstruct it, we are going back to our basics, save for that we are using technology to have a greater reach, have millions of people listening in from the world over. It's a unifying platform. It's an equalizing platform in that sense, and it also gives you the joy of the grain of a voice telling you a story, and you get hooked on, which is what is amazing. Although I will put an honest disclaimer here that horror is one genre that I am terrified of. So Nikesh, I'd rather listen to you if you. I listen to all the poetry that you've done, but. But you guys are in an absolutely brilliant space. Now, when it comes to literary agent looking at podcasts, I just have a very interesting thing to say that when the pandemic broke out last year, I have an author who I have tremendous respect for and whom I represent, called Pranay Lal, and he had done this book, Indica, which is the natural history of the Indian subcontinent. And he just, by the way, sent me a link of one of the podcasts he had done like early last year by about, I can't even remember, March or April. And he said, Mita, listen to this. And I said, sure. And I listened to it, and it was on the natural history of viruses. So I called him casually and I said, you know what? There's a book in here, Pranay. Get going, get started. And literally, you will not believe it. We are almost like literally a month away from releasing one of the most important books on the natural history of viruses, called The Invisible Empire, coming out through Penguin. So, it's a storytelling medium which gives you, either you can stream off of it or bounce off or spring off of it, or it can be led to a podcast. Like, for example, Freakonomics, so many years back, went on from a book to become a very successful podcast and took a life of its own. Or if you look at what Stephen Fry is doing with his books, he has a podcast and he accompanies it with a YouTube channel. So, and so does Sam Harris, and so does someone like, there's this very strong, very refreshing feminist writer called Deepa Narayan, who's based in the US, but she's running a very successful podcast on masculinity in India called What's a Man? And we've been talking to each other about how do we then take this to another form of communication, or another way of getting this content out, be it a book, be it a web series, be it whatever. So this interrelation that is being encouraged between publishing, between podcasts, between representing podcasters to different channels is just such a huge playing field for us right now. It's really exciting to be part of exploring these possibilities, frankly.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Mita. And that's exactly, the opportunity that like we're seeing as well, like at Bound, which is these interlinks, right? Between writing, between storytelling, between podcasting, and how they all sort of like fit into each other. And I'll come back to this with my next question, but I also want to sort of talk a little bit about myself. So I have very similar experience to all of you. I started off as a writer. I always loved listening to, like what Mita, you said about oral storytelling. I loved listening to myths and, listening to things on the radio. And I had listened to maybe one podcast before I joined Bound last year. So it's actually for me been exactly 1 year of, working with podcasts. And when I started, I very much thought of myself as a book person, and I was like, I'm a reader. I consume information by reading and I work with books, and that's what I know best. And I thought that working with podcasts would be, challenging, but it really wasn't. And I've really grown to love audio as a medium, listen to podcasts for fun, for work, and also realized how much, it took me back to like listening to myths and all of those things. And I also realized how much editing a book is very similar to editing a podcast, being a podcast producer. And also with the book people and, starting my own podcast from scratch, it's been like a whole other experience. And like Nikesh and Aastha, maybe you can speak to this, but I absolutely love being a host. Because I love having these conversations with people, and that whole experience has been very, very interesting and very surprising from what I thought podcasting was going to be like. And that's something that we hear a lot from our community as well, which is, they don't know what to expect when they're going to start a podcast. And the actual experience of creating one and what goes into creating a podcast is so different from what we think it is going to be when we're starting off. um, but I also want to get into these interlinks that we're seeing, and I want to know, because all of you work with so many different mediums, like whether it's music, whether it's writing, whether it's poetry. um, do you feel like your experience with writing and storytelling has influenced you or has helped you in some way with podcasts? Nikesh, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. I mean, in Indian Noir's case, the answer is a no-brainer. Absolutely. I mean, the stories in Indian Noir are written according to the 3-act structure. For the horror story, so it's written more like a horror movie. For the crime and the action thrillers, it's more like a TV show with the 5-act structure. So knowing the act structures really well, being able to tell a story within that structure, and by that what I mean is knowing how to develop characters, using language to create worlds that readers can immerse themselves in. Those are key skills that are absolutely needed to be able to deliver a convincing podcast. And I think regardless of whether it's fiction or non-fiction, there are some structural elements that harkens back to the traditions established by fiction or non-fiction writing that hosts use to make those connections. So that's a bit of a no-brainer. But I've used this opportunity to also talk about the other kind of literary linkages to expand on what Mita was saying before. I think with podcasts, it's particularly important that it evolves and builds those connections with books and with movies and television shows to really exploit its potential. So there is an exploitation of the qualities of Indian Noir that's happening now in the audio medium, but so much could happen in the book medium, which is so essential for it. So much of that could be used in the television medium and the movie medium, more so television because it's written like a television show. So just like a book, the podcast has that identity wherein it completely blossoms as a flower in full bloom during spring, when it actually builds those bridges with those other mediums. And to answer coming back to your question again, at the core of that are those structural elements that make a story a thrilling story. And you kind of see this replicated in the structure of Indian Noir in a lot of ways. So, we usually have a crime story, then a horror story, then a crime story, then a horror story. And they're all written, regardless of the genre, like a thriller. So when people finish a season of one, they're waiting for the next one to drop in when another one hits them. So they are now compelled to listen to that. At the end of that, they're thinking, I want to know what happens next. But then that stops, and then the crime story returns again. Even in that pattern, you can see how literary traditions influence its production. So absolutely integral to its coming together as a craft.
That's great. Aastha?
I think for me, more than being a fiction writer, it's being a journalist that has sort of helped me with my podcast. First of all, because we're a non-fiction podcast. We talk about love and relationships, and I think just being a journalist now for 20 years has made me confident enough to say anything and not think about, if it's edited or things like that. I mean, we're pretty, and even Ankit has been a journalist, so both of us are pretty candid and pretty outgoing in that way on our podcast. And I think that has come from being a journalist for so many years. Obviously, it helps to know the language, and that comes from writing that comes from writing for 20 years, be it as a journalist or be it as an author. So obviously language skills come from there. But for me, it's mostly been, and I mean, I guess in a way what I do is, because I write for a Sunday paper, I am telling stories. I'm not just reporting on things. We write longer features, we write, and it is about a narrative, and it is about, as anything else, it is about a beginning, middle, end. So I think we know how to structure it because I have been writing for so long. So in that way, it's all connected. It is a storytelling in audio format. But yeah, I think it's me being a journalist that has made more of a difference with my podcast in that way.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And I think with, both of your answers also, what I'm seeing is also it makes us very aware of the audience in a sense, or the listener or the reader, because, whether we're writing fiction or non-fiction, that's something that we learn to develop, right? Which is also using language in a certain way based on what we perceive the audience to be and what would appeal to them, which I think really, at least for me, has really like also helped me look at podcasts in a different way when we script
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
the way we speak, stuff like that. Mita, what would your perspective be?
Um, I want to raise a couple of points here which have concerned me. Although, and I do want to go back to what Nikesh and Asta both have said about the writing and the literary traditions part. But so if you look at the boom in podcasts right now, it's coming hot on the heels of streaming services like the OTT platforms. Like if you look at Spotify or the Google podcast or iHeart or whatever, they are like the Netflix of podcasts, if you see. Now, there is a lot of creativity when two of you are showing that right now. Your creativity is, and as storytellers, whether fiction or non-fiction, is coming across. My I think before I give my perspective, I have a couple of concerns because I'm coming from the other side. I'm coming from the side of dealing with the written word, right? Mostly. Do you think having a podcast is just about enough because you're just throwing it in on one of the where you're dropping it in on one of the platforms? Don't you think it is more, its function is more to be working as an element, as a part of an entire content spread, and it has to be in conjunction and a part of that digital universe, and it has to be really well integrated for it to reach that atomic culmination, of having millions of people just listening in. And like Nikesh said very correctly, he has more listenership than most successful crime writers or horror story writers have in terms of readership, because book sales are what they are. So, which was a fantastic point that he made. The thing here is that, like, when I read Stephen Fry, I also go immediately to his YouTube channel to see what he's saying, and then go on to listen to his podcast. So, do you think these are important? Um, like, it's good to have a cog in different platforms to make a podcast successful. Sorry, I've meandered away from
No,
you.
no, no. I think yeah.
It's something that I've been feeling, because literally when I listened to Deepa's podcast on What's a Man, I literally had a conversation with her and said, Deepa, you know what, you need to turn this into a book, and then maybe into, you already are a TED talker, you're a TED speaker. So how are we proceeding into another medium? So each spoke in the wheel actually makes it go round, is what I'm trying to say. As far as podcasts are concerned, especially because a visual medium will keep a viewer hooked on more because it's attracting, whereas a listener can get tuned off very easily. where I'm coming back to that point that Nikesh spoke about, where he's talking about it being written more like a TV show with 5 acts, and to keep your listeners gripped. What kind of literary traditions come into play? That was something that made me very curious. It's fascinating for me. And Astha, especially when you're talking about a ever-changing, fluid scene of how relationships play out, and we've seen the latest angles coming in because of the pandemic, and we know what's happened with relationships, and people have gone kind of berserk. Um, it's just I'd love to understand more of this narrative arc, which plays out so differently, and yet it is similar because you are, whether fiction or non-fiction, a storyteller.
Right.
Yeah, I think well, you're right in that way that maybe it works along with other things better. Like I'm sure Nikesh would agree. Like if you go to my Instagram, I talk about love and relationships in many formats, be it through reels, be it through poems, be it through poetry, be it through self-love motivation quotes. I also have written 4 books, and my last book, which came out last month with HarperCollins, is called The L Word, which is about love and lust and everything in the middle. So it is non-fiction giving advice to kids. So it is sort of the podcast as a book format. If someone is not listening to it, then they get all the advice that I've given maybe through the podcast in the book as well. I sing love songs. So I write romance books. I talk about love on my Instagram, and the podcast is also, so the root of it is maybe words and love, but there are many things that I go through and do with it. So I think sort of it adds to that whole uh, a whole mechanism. So it's like an ecosystem of a lot of things which are connected to love. So for me, I think that works well, because someone, when they hear my podcast, they're like, okay, she does write about romance. I'm India's second Mills and Boons writer. So I wrote my first book 10 years ago, which was a Mills and Boons. So I have a romantic tradition right behind me. So yeah, so somewhere there's this legitimacy ki, okay, she writes about romance, she's been writing about romance, she sings love songs, she writes poetry on romance. So maybe what she's saying about love and relationships might just be relevant. And
Right.
as a journalist also, I think I have reported about how relationships have changed all through my career. So specifically in the last 2 years, with what happened in the pandemic, we have done many stories about how relationships changed, how divorces increased, how dating was in the pandemic, how it was hard for couples to live together during the pandemic. So that's a part of my journalism career as well. So I think it all does connect together. So when I am talking about love on the podcast, I have a lot of things that back me up to give me sort of some kind of legitimacy with it, you know.
Yeah,
So
no,
I
it
think
wasn't
it
just
works.
thinking,
legitimacy, it was
I was
just
just thinking, listening to this, that you couldn't have this a better conversation this with these 3 different people on here, because Mita is a legend in the business. She holds the key to a lot of um, publishers who would be able to create one of those spokes for a lot of the podcasts. And she's so well versed in all these different mediums, and have met authors who've experimented in both. And then we have Aastha, who has experienced that journey, wherein she is a successful writer, journalist, and a podcaster. And then you have me as a third subset, where I haven't had that bridge that Aastha has, in that I haven't had that publishing element, but then I have the lack of that has caused me to lean heavily on the podcasting side to find a way to get to my audience. So this is just absolutely fascinating for me, and I'm sure it's absolutely fascinating for the listeners as well. I think I can summarize what's been discussed over the last few minutes by saying that, returning back to the sentiment, the image that Mita's created, really, it is about thinking about it as a wheel, and these things different spokes. And I just feel like podcasting has a thicker spoke than a lot of the other mediums, because of the power of audio medium. And you can see this in the sales of audiobooks as well. For a lot of companies, audiobooks are salvaging their business because of the ability of narrators to come in and really elevate material, or make an existing material shine even more. So I'm so kind of leaning heavily on that strategy, so that in case I'm not lucky enough to find a book audience, at least I can have an audience that can consume my stories through the audio medium. But totally, these are all interconnected. These all help each other if you're a creator. And from a product point of view, it's important to have these bridges to all these different industries, the television industry, the book industry. I mean, I would love to have one of the Indian Noir series to be a book series. I think it'll take a different life on its own. Similarly with TV shows as well.
Actually, a lot of that is happening, Nikesh. Sorry, I'm butting in, but
absolutely, yeah.
I'm
No,
very
go on, please.
concerned about you not having found a book audience, which is what I said in the beginning, that you're.
This is totally me, by the way. I'm just talking about my experience. Obviously, Mita continue, because she knows she's making these things happen. So please go ahead, Mita.
No, Nikesh, but I said in the my opening statement that what you said about not finding a publisher hurt me, because here you are telling such brilliant stories, and not having found a publisher, well, that's a conversation that concerns me, because it's for us to bring the right kind of people to the forefront and make sure they get published. So that's what I meant when I said that hurt me, because you need to be read, not just heard.
You're a wonderful woman. I have sympathies for the industry as well. I really appreciate, even though I say it with a bit of pain that I haven't been able to get that access. I actually really appreciate the work that literary agents and editors do in all these publishing houses. They have to troll through millions and millions of manuscripts just to get to the kind of gems. And it's almost like a lottery now, because a lot more people write as well. So it's not said with any kind of antagonism. It's just the nature of the industry. It's very hard.
It is very hard. But what's really amazing about the power of the voice is that it's not only just basically that you can lead into a book publishing deal, but you can also, there's a lot of creativity that's being picked up as fresh content. People are scouting podcasts now for picking up for like fresh stories for the OTTs, or for feature films, or for docuseries. So there's a reverse thing happening. Like there is this osmosis happening across, which is I think the most brilliant aspect, and which is what you really need to probably highlight and celebrate for podcasters.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're coming across as a fresh voice.
Yeah.
And
can I also take this opportunity? Can I also take this opportunity to just highlight for the people who are listening about how much of an inspiration Aastha really is, and has been over the years as well. But for a creator, I think one of the things I always tell people is, don't be fixated on a single medium, even though I am doing it now, but with the goal of being able to expand in the future. So I'm still aligning that goal towards in the way that I create my podcast in such a way that in the future it can spread out to other mediums. So that's very important. But let's just highlight Aastha for a second for people who are listening as a creator. She's just so multi-dimensional. And I think as an artist, you should start thinking about that. How great your art could be in the book medium, in the podcast medium, as a journalist. I mean, that's exactly what you should be trying to aspire to. And that is something that constantly drives me every day as well. So I just wanted to highlight that as well in terms of the strategies and kind of techniques in play as well. But go ahead.
Right. So this has been a really great conversation, and I just want to bring it back to also giving my perspective as a producer, because I think what each one of you said has been very interesting, and I love Mita's wheel sort of analogy, because I do agree that even when I'm having conversations with podcasters, it's always either they are an expert at something and hence they should start a podcast to talk about their area of expertise, or they have a book and how that book can be converted into a podcast, or a podcast that can be converted into a book. And it's sort of looking at these this fluidity between stories. But it's also really interesting because I would say that at this point I feel like it's something that's happening right now, because I would say like a few decades ago you could be an author and be just that. Like you could write a book and just be an author and not need to have these spokes and multiple identities where you put out content. But right now, even for authors, right, like for writers, an advice that we have to give them is, if you're writing on something, make sure you're also talking about it on social media. Make sure you're also putting out other kinds of content pieces where you're talking about the same topic. Where I think whether you're a writer, like a author, or a podcaster, or creating content in any other way, it has just become sort of the sign of the times where you have to do it in multiple forms or multiple formats in order to reach multiple audiences. Because I could, if I want to talk about something, I could write a book and it would reach readers, which is a very specific audience. But then if I wanted to reach a broader audience, I would have to say the same thing in a podcast, and then maybe say the same thing in another format to reach a different kind of audience. And I think that is how we're sort of looking at how different mediums and the same conversations in different mediums reach different audiences. And I definitely agree that Astha has been able to do that with her books, with her podcast. And Nikesh, hopefully, like because you've really leaned into your podcast, and you've made it into it into like such an amazing storytelling experience where it's sort of this thing of like, even if you do end up publishing books related to horror, related to your podcast, it would be probably the same audience, because you have such a huge followership at this point. It will be probably your listeners which will then buy your books.
Yeah,
So it all
yeah.
sort of
And I think it's
feeds
an
into
important
each other.
strategy to employ if you are intending to go in those directions. And I think for this reason, the two strategies that I've employed, which I think is worthwhile thinking about if you are at a podcast, if you're thinking about going into podcasts for listeners, is that I have on purpose ensured that the literary quality of the writing is good enough for it to be a book. And at the same time, that the act structures and the way the stories are put together are good enough for it to be translated into a screenplay. It's a very conscious choice to play the lottery really smartly. And then obviously really lean into the production quality of the podcast, so that even if strategy A, books, strategy B, movies or TV shows don't work out, strategy C works really well. And I think this is where like planning for a good podcast is very important even before you start. I spent at least an year trying to gauge what genres would work really well, where there wasn't too much competition, or where I could go in and really compete so that not many people could compete with me. So,
Right.
or it would be a few people who could do that. So I think, like this kind of preliminary planning, which you have summarized very beautifully, Aishwarya, is I think very important.
Yeah.
It's actually, but if you look at Amit Verma's podcast, he's been around, he actually spearheaded that scene in India. And he's got one book to his credit, and after that his podcasts have just taken off. But that he hasn't gone back to writing.
But I think with that, I feel it also depends on writing. I've realized is a vocation. Now, if some people, you can say something can be a great book, but if the person is not a writer in their heads, I don't think they can maybe they'll write one book, or they'll write maybe two, but that's not inside them. For me, I feel like writers make sense of the world by writing. So those are the writers that I will continue to do maybe many things. I want to make a YouTube show as well, and I want to like write an OTT, but I will continue to write my books as long as I live, because that is something that is who I am. I'm a writer first. So
Yeah.
I think that it sort of comes from that. So it may be a great idea, but I don't know if everybody can convert everything to a book.
Yeah.
So
And then
Right.
I
You're
think it's
very
also
right.
the satisfaction, right? Because for some people, they can write something, and no matter what format they're writing for, it'll give them the same sort of satisfaction. But then some people might just have a preference for, okay, I prefer writing books, and that's my thing, and that's what I'm more comfortable with, versus like I prefer podcasts because it's easier to write, or whatever people's reasonings might be. But it might also just be one of those things where something takes off in a way that another thing doesn't, or some format works better for people than others do. Like if a writer is like really introverted and doesn't like speaking, then even if they have a great podcast idea, that might just not be their thing.
Yeah.
because they're more comfortable with writing.
Yeah, I'm glad that Aastha raised that point about, personally, I think that if you write one book or if you write several books, you're still a writer, provided you've invested the time in it. But I still ascribe very much to the philosophy that Aastha has espoused. This is because of my kind of inherently competitive nature against my own craft. I think that if you think about it as a vocation, just as Aastha rightly pointed, which is just a constant journey of testing yourself. This is where like the ability to produce writing on a regular basis becomes a real, a test of whether you're good at your vocation. And interestingly, that actually helps with your podcasting as well, because the key thing with podcasting is regularity, being able to produce content on a weekly basis, and to be able to do this over a long period of time. The stamina, the mental endurance that's required for writing, that will come in really handy for producing the really successful podcast. So I'm glad you raised that point, and I think that is also something very much to think about as people in the audience. Have you reached the stage where you can actually push yourself into making this a vocation, and with all those strategic inputs put in there, and be able to test your stamina? And I say go for it. I mean, what else are you waiting for? Unless you are a trust fund baby or you've won a lottery, really, you've got the opportunity to like test yourself through your life about whether you're good at your vocation. In fact, it's a great strategy for your mental health because it takes your worry away from other things that are not under your control. You're just constantly competing with yourself, with your talent, with your ability to produce content, be it books, whatever it is. And it's good. It's a good test of yourself.
Right. Absolutely. So, what interesting trends, if any, have you noticed in the podcasting ecosystem? Whether in India or globally. And do you think that there's something missing, or something that needs to happen in this ecosystem in order for podcasts to really flourish, or sort of to take podcasts to the next level right now?
I think the only thing that is missing, I don't know about trends. I think podcasts are very personal, and anything can work. You don't know what works. As long as the person talking about it in the podcast is passionate, anything might just work. But I do feel that this India has this fascination, or I don't know if it's all over the world, but it has this fascination of turning everything into a celebrity-led thing, which is like, oh, we'll get Karan Johar to do a podcast, and we'll get Neha Dhupia to do a podcast, and then those people become your podcasters. Well, that's just like, and then the real people who are actually your real podcasters get like a little sidelined, because now it's become, again, it's like, okay, so let's just flood this also with the same 10 celebrities that are everywhere. So I just feel that fascination of getting an already established celebrity to do something like that should go away. Podcasters should be it should be about creating new stars and new celebrities, which is a different kind of celebrity. So to focus on more of the OG content creators and what they're creating, instead of getting celebrities to make that, to make a podcast, I think it's very different. So I just feel like in India, everything turns into one celebrity ridden thing, be it social media, be it podcasting, be it music. And you see the same people everywhere. And then that's not fun. I want to see new people. I want to like new people, and I want to see new people as celebrities. So I think that is something that I'm not fond of and I feel podcasting is becoming going in that direction.
Yeah.
So I'm a little upset about that, but other than that, I think if you're passionate about it, your podcast will work. So it's not no trends. You can do anything. You can do a podcasting on knitting now, and it might just work after Tom Daly sat at the Olympics with his knitting. So you never know.
Yeah.
There is a podcast by someone, Amelia something, and it's just about what she's looking at around her in that point in time, and she just talks about it, and she's hugely popular. Can't remember her surname, but yeah, I did come across that podcast, and I did try and listen in. I agree with Aastha that we are here to discover fresh creativity, new talent, new forms of storytelling. And the podcast gives you that vibrancy, which is very required. So that's one sec. Sorry. I think that's the potential that is yet to be totally explored in India. And my other concern in India is that the monetizing of a podcast is still such a huge challenge, right? Because when I was trying to get a contract done for one of my writers for him to become a podcaster, that's where we got stuck at. And then we were told that, oh, after the first few episodes, then some sponsorship might come in. And I was like, but that's not a viable way to work. I mean, look at the amount of hard work and sweat and imagination and your own, your time, your energy, all your skills come into play as a writer. And you're throwing yourself out there because you're actually throwing your voice into the audience, which is another very energy consuming activity. So there has to be something more that will ride this industry, and it doesn't need to be celebrity driven, but like there are podcasts that are actually also what is good that is happening in India, and it's not all that bleak, is there are lots of podcasts coming out in our languages, I think, which is a very, very important part that we cannot miss, So that is something that is so heartening to see, that nobody's waiting for, okay, let the English podcast take off first or the Hindi podcast take off first. But there are podcasts simultaneously coming out in different languages, which are probably doing even better than mainstream languages, which is fantastic. So that's one part that's really positive.
Yeah, what I'd like to add is quite similar to what the other panelists have stated here. So I will talk about some of the trends as well. But firstly, let me give you a bit of an anecdote about some of my writer friends, which I'm sure have the same problems as writers in India as well, in terms of the celebrity issue, which is that, when they go to a publisher here in Australia, they ask them, what their kind of movie appearances are or TV appearances are, what their Instagram audience is. And I know this happens sometimes in India. It definitely happens in the podcasting space. There are very few podcasters like myself, who have landed exclusivity deals, who are able to make a living out of, who are able to make a substantial amount of money out of doing podcasting. But a vast amount of people are just working their butts off with no remuneration. And I think the issue here is the ad ecosystem. So one change that I hope will happen is that the ad agencies in India start taking the medium a lot more seriously, understand that it's a different medium that's a lot more immersive, and for that reason, ads have more bang for buck versus your Instagram ad, which people just flick past because they moved on to the next image in 3 seconds, so that you then validate the work that podcasters do for you. And I hope the streamers as well, the trend is very clear, is that the first port of call is for, I understand the ones that are existingly successful, that makes sense, but then there is this huge amount of investment in celebrity podcasts. And some of them are just so boring. They just really don't have anything to say. I mean, they look great when they put up their 3 snaps from Maldives, but when they open their mouth and talk about something, you may as well want to jump into the waters of Maldives and just end your life. So, are you giving value to the work based on their quality in writing this in terms of this podcast? So I really hope the streamers start considering that as an important element. Trends, as Mita said, I think the big thing, and even now when I speak to streamers as well, the huge potential in regional podcasting comes to my mind. Everyone I know, I tell them, you know what, 5 years from now, people are going to forget about the English podcast. It's the ones in Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam. They're going to be the superstars with their millions of really engaged social media crazy audiences that are going to really transform their lives. So that's really happening. So if you're listening to this, if you're a podcaster, if you're really good in your own regional language, celebrate it, try to do work in it. And I think, success will come much more easier than if you're kind of starting with an English language podcast again in a quite a saturated feed. Although, while saying that, can I also say that a lot of the podcasts haven't really tried really hard to really distinguish themselves. So I think the next few years we'll see them really trying to up the game, trying to compete with the really good ones, or perishing because they realize it takes a lot of stamina to keep producing content at a particular high quality, at a particular frequency. You will also, I think, start seeing other mediums, like, for example, in storytelling, choose your own adventures are something people haven't done. Audio dramas haven't been really done that well in India. So there is just, I think, like a huge market base there for audio dramas with multiple voice actors, with great sound design, yet to play out. I think, that is a sure buy for most of the big podcasting services. I think interview podcasts are done to death. If you are doing it, I think you should really do it at the level of what Bound India is doing at the moment. It needs to at least hit that quality to be able to deliver something good. And if you're doing one, make sure you have an active YouTube channel. At a lot of the bigger conferences this year, the bets are on the 3-minute podcasts. Apparently, they're going to be the big things, and I'm not surprised. People have the attention spans of goldfish now, so this is a no-brainer that people would want to go for the shorter formats. But at the end of all this, I think, let me summarize by saying, stating an anecdote that I had the other day, which was Courtney Cox, who played Monica in Friends, saying that I hear these people talking about the TV numbers now. I don't know what they're talking about. Millions of people used to watch us, which is true. Friends used to be watched by millions of people. Now, the greatest TV show hits are in the 6 figures. They've been hit the 7 figures. And so what
Friends
you need to
is
understand
still being watched.
And
I said it's still being watched. Yeah.
Exactly. Still their audience is millions, right? So I think the audience attention span, the audience segments have bifurcated a bit, and you should be very realistic about the numbers you can generate for your art now, even more so than now, which is really weird. There's a lot more people linked into media now. But I think, the next phase will be the period of people who have realistic expectations, are more strategic in their approach to producing content, are more attuned to regional languages as a medium to reach a wider base, and also the domain of people who really, going back to what Aastha was saying before, think about how their vocation can perhaps tie into the podcasting. They are the ones that will last the longest. That's my summary of that.
Right. Thanks, Nikesh. And I think, what Mita and Nikesh, you both said about regional podcasts is very interesting, because actually, one of the questions that a member of the PodSquad had and had sort of asked us to ask you was about regional podcasts and whether, they are a great opportunity and whether they should sort of get started on that right now to, be ahead of the curve. And so I think
yes,
that
they should. They should.
Yeah.
They should. No, the richness of our languages and the storytelling that can happen through that is just unparalleled.
Yeah. So I'm sure that they'll be very happy with that answer.
Yeah, tonight. Start tonight. Stop everything. Divorce your husband. Sell everything you've got. Invest in it starting tonight. Prepare for a 3-year long haul, and I have no doubt one of the streaming services will buy you out, because they are begging. They are begging for that content. I would have loved, I'm trying to get to Indian Noir into other languages. It's just so hard to get it to work with other people to produce it at the level that you want it. So there's a lot of struggles ahead of you to get the best content you can. So really, you have to start today to be able to even start thinking about it. So you shouldn't be wasting a second.
Absolutely. And what you all also said about celebrity podcasts becoming really big, or sort of, I feel like all of this feeds into each other, which is I would say sort of the lack of support in some way or the other for OG podcasters to become big by themselves. Because if the kind of resources that are available are for people who have already established themselves in some or the other field, whether storytelling in some different format, or they are experts, or they have a huge social media following, which then it becomes easier for them to become podcasters. But whether we are talking about monetizing podcasts, whether we're talking about ad revenue, whether we're talking about support in terms of resources like information, or whether we're talking about just knowing people, right? Like knowing the right people, like having connections, or just having information about where to even get started, how to do things. I feel like the lack of that and all of that sort of feeds in together for sometimes people to not be able to start podcasts because they want to start a podcast and not for any other reason, not because they have something to promote, not because they already have an established brand that they want to expand, but to just start a podcast for the sake of it. And I feel like hopefully once those resources start building up, because podcasts are fairly new still in India, right? If those kind of resources start building up, if we start having a lot of content platforms like iHeartRadio, which start creating podcasts and maybe hiring people, right, and hiring new people who just want to work in the storytelling and the podcasting field, and hopefully grow podcasts into sort of an industry of its own, right? Like how publishing is an industry right now, and the film industry is its own thing, and maybe hopefully that will also allow people to be more creative, right, and earn money and do podcasting in a way where they can sustain themselves, right, and get some value for the amount of effort that they're putting in there. So I definitely agree with all of you, and all of your insights have been super super helpful. But I also want to open this up to the audience that we have here and see if they have any, like maybe one question that we can answer before we end the panel, because we're at 6 p.m. So if any of you have a question, do let us know.
I wanted to ask something. Thank you for such a wonderful discussion, by the way. I wanted to know, because a lot of people, when they're starting off with podcasts, their main hurdle generally is that they think it's very tech heavy, and they assume that it requires a certain amount of investment, not just of time, but also other resources. And so would you agree with that? Or would you say that there is something else that needs to be your primary focus if you're planning to start your own podcast?
Aastha, did you want to go first?
No, you go first.
Sure. Look, I have a definitive answer for this. I think it's the skill that you have in a particular craft or expertise in a particular area that's going to really help you build an audience and build up the skills to generate content. So if you look at Aastha, she's been a journalist, she's a romance writer, she's been interested, she's been vested in the topic of love and dating for a long time. And she has got multiple talents that she uses to link up with that message that then folds into podcasting. So if you look at me, I've spent 20 years learning how to write stories in a thriller format in particular, and with a particular focus on crime, action thrillers, and horror. You really cannot purchase those skills overnight. Although, and I just say, the beauty of the internet age is that now you have a lot more people teaching these skills on the internet. So you can actually invest a few months learning them, and then it's up to you to practice intensely so that you build up your skill level. So you can do it in a shorter time frame. But that skill building, that building of knowledge, is the thing that's going to keep the content new, fresh, excellent, enduring, and it will give you the stamina to last over a long period of time. So let me give you a bit of an insight into Indian Noir, for example. It takes 8.5 hours to produce 15 minutes of Indian Noir. So that's, writing, rewriting, editing, narrating, cutting, mixing, SFX. You have to do this week in and week out while you have a full-time job and your family and a life. You're talking about a different kind of endurance. And I want to talk about something that Aastha, I'm very glad she brought up, which is the whole idea of vocation. This is kind of having this inner persona where you are constantly testing your skill level. Building that shows a love for your craft more than a love for a new mic or a fancy software or excellent plugins or a great studio. If you have those skill sets built in, then those other things, you can buy a $100 package and have an excellent studio system now at home. I have a very simple recording setup. So do most of the podcasters. So that would be my answer to that.
I think Akshay just, all that Nikesh said is obviously right, and it's always good to educate yourself on everything. But go with what you know about. Go with what you want to talk about. Be it as niche or be it as popular. But don't do something which because it works for someone else. It is not good. Most probably, it might not work for you. So just do what you really want to do, what you know about, what you're an expert on, and I think you should be fine, and you'll figure it out as you go along what your audience wants, and then maybe you'll figure out what you want to give them more of.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with both of these points. And I think, what Nikesh, you said about technology, because I do feel like a lot of podcasters, start off and their biggest fear or their biggest anxiety is sort of buying all these technical sort of equipment, right? And being able to spend that money initially and make that financial investment in buying fancy software and figuring out the technical aspects and that becoming sort of the focus of what podcasting is about. But I do agree with this thing of you can have the simplest setup, as long as you know what you're talking about, as long as you're passionate about it. And
Yeah, and the internet's made it easy for you to actually skill up. What has taken
yeah,
me 20 years might only take you a few years. So we know that Bound India runs writing classes. I do writing and podcasting classes. So does Bound as well. Yeah, depending on how how much you want to sort of invest in learning things quickly, you can do it now. Once upon a time, that would have been an impossibility. I'm very curious about what Mita thinks as well. Like the ability of writers to skill up now versus how it was when she probably started off in the industry.
Oh, well, there's been a vast change. I can say that for sure. Um, I agree with what both you and Astha have said about the writing and about the vocation part, and with what Aishwarya said about just doing what, and Astha also said it, what works for you, because that will make you honest, straight from the heart, and that's exactly what I tell my writers when I am mentoring them, saying if don't do not be affected in the way you write. You know, there are times when people send me stuff which, when they're thinking in their mother tongue and they're writing in English, and I write back to them immediately saying, you know what, you should just write in your own language. Maybe you'll have a solid blockbuster on your table. Or on your laptop now. So yeah, I agree with everything that's been said by all three of you, and it applies to the written word as well, not just for podcasts, but basically telling your stories in whatever form you want. Um, it just holds true for all of that. And yes, there is a change because 15, 17, 18 years back, even publishers weren't experimenting with genres so much as they started experimenting more than a decade ago. So that led to writers also experimenting very differently with different genres, which has been a very, very exciting time for this discovery and exploration for people like us, and which keeps us going. I still open every manuscript submission with that same greed that I started off with and Siahi began. And there's something positive that's happening, right? Which is keeping that appetite whetted. So I guess we should be just optimistic and move on from there.
absolutely. I think maybe we could answer another question. I think a lot of people have questions here uh, that they want to ask. So, Sharvani, did you want to go first?
Are there questions in the?
Yeah, there are questions in the chat box as well.
Hmm.
So one is about poetry podcasts, and there's a question about uh, monetizing podcasts. So if any of you want to answer either of these questions.
I was actually very surprised that poetry podcasts work, but they work.
Oh,
But
they
they are
work
on the
really,
charts. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're on the
they
charts.
work so well.
Yeah, I think it just depends on your delivery, how you can say the poem out, and all those things are important. There's a young poet called Megha Rao. She does very well
Yeah.
on Spotify. So you would be surprised. That's what I mean by you can do whatever you want, and you never know what connects with people. So if you have a poetry podcast, please do go ahead with it.
Yeah.
And as far as monetization is concerned, I would say I really don't know about how much people are getting paid in podcasts. So the reason that we left our first platform was because for a third season, Seven said that they can't pay us, and I was just like, as a creator, after doing two successful seasons, I'm not going to do a third season without having some remuneration, so
Yeah.
but I don't know if and Spotify, obviously, because we're a Spotify original, we are getting paid by Spotify, and that is amazing, and touchwood, and thank you to Spotify for that. But I don't know how many podcasts are getting money. uh, Again, this is where I say that first get started, see how it goes. First 12 episodes, I mean, it also has to work for someone to maybe put in money on you, other than of course, if you're already a celebrity and they bring you on to do a podcast. But get started first. Don't see podcasting as the money making part of your life. It is not that in the beginning, but now I think there are a lot of podcasting websites. Like there's something called Podcash, I think, which help you monetize your podcast, and those will help you. But I think in the beginning, at least for your first season, for your first 12 episodes, try and first see what content works. What is it? What is happening with it? What kind of audience does it have? Is it even working? And
Yeah.
then maybe we can go ahead to the monetizing part of it, which I'm sure there are many websites and many platforms now who are helping podcasts, because it has become a economy of sorts.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Just to add to that, after what you're saying, I think now even Spotify and Apple Podcasts have started subscription models where you can, have subscribers who can pay sort of a certain minimal amount to get like extra content from your
Exactly,
podcast.
but that again, for that
So
also your podcast has to reach some point.
yeah,
Now,
exactly.
if I stop Love Aaj Kal tomorrow and I tell the already existing people that pay me $10 for every 10 minutes, maybe they will, because they already know what we are giving them.
Yeah.
But I don't think when
Yeah.
you start off that might work. Like I started a newsletter recently, and Substack gives you this option where you can monetize it right away. So I was like, even if should I ask them even 1 rupee, 1 rupee for a newsletter? And I was like, why would they even pay that 1 rupee when they don't know what my newsletter has? So let
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
get used to it, and then maybe I can ask that 1 rupee for a day for a newsletter.
Yeah.
So I think,
Monetization is so
Definitely.
hard. It's so hard. I think a couple of things I want to say with the poetry one is that, I'm a person who started, even though I didn't start a poetry podcast, I started through poetry recitation. That became a window for getting into Indian Noir. So, I strongly recommend that. And poetry is one of those mediums where it is the toughest thing to write, and it's also the toughest thing to narrate because, recite, sorry, because you have to be, you have to put yourself into the mental scape of really hugging the words and really pronouncing and emoting.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's very hard to do that. And so yeah, it's a great testing ground for you. Really encourage. Podcast let slam poet, because of the slam poetry as well. Podcasting is a great medium to test that and have an audience from that space as well. With monetizing, what I want to say is, right now it's a game of the superstars. That's what the big streaming services are picking on, which is people who were indie, who just struggled through for years and built an audience, and so they're purchasing them. Then they're purchasing the celebrities they know will immediately have an audience. That's where it's at. every other kind of monetization, and I'm saying this to you because I've tried all of those, like the Patreons of the world, the ad agencies of the world. It's extremely hard, very difficult to gain any traction from it. But this is one of the things where if you don't persist and try now, you don't know what changes are going to happen. And if you're not in the right place at the right time to effect those, to ride that wave, then you don't get that opportunity at all. So this is the same with writing as well. Like, a lot of people hope and pray that someone like Mita would pick up the manuscript and champion that to someone. And as a run of luck, that might happen. But if you didn't take that first step, you would never get to that point where she opens that email. So there's that. I'll also quickly answer one of the questions that's in the chat from Adya Shah, the conventions of writing shows from OTT platforms.
I think Nikesh's network. Yeah. All right. I hope he can join back in. But I think that that's the end of the questions for now. And I hope Nikesh was here for my wrap up and me saying thank you to him, but I'll just have to say that to him personally. But this has been a really, really great session, and I really want to thank both of you, Mita, Aastha, and Nikesh, if he's here, for having such a great conversation. It sort of went off the rails, but in the best way possible, because I think it really felt like a conversation where we were able to talk about what interested us about podcasts. And hopefully, everyone who's here and all of our listeners, anyone who tuned in on YouTube, will also find this super, super insightful. So thank you for coming in here and talking to us about podcasts. And thank you for being a part of this whole PodSquad initiative that we're starting. And hopefully all of you will be a part of the PodSquad. So if you want to be a part of the PodSquad, we have a WhatsApp group actually that we're creating where we talk about podcasts every day. And today we're talking about what kind of podcast listeners we are. So if anyone wants to be a part of that, the link for that will be in the chat box. But thank you for coming in, and this has been a really, really great conversation. I hope you both enjoyed it as well.
Well,
Thank you, Aishwarya.
Thank you so much for having me, Aishwarya. I told you in the beginning I'll derail the whole thing. I warned you.
No, but
No, you had, but I knew you would do it in a good way.
I just want to say last, like anybody, don't overthink doing anything. You want to start a podcast, you start the podcast. You want to write a book, write the book. I feel overthinking and over going into it. Will it work? Will it not work? Will it get money? Will it? All these things derail everybody's creative process. Please don't think so much about it. Creativity has to be, just do it, and it'll find an audience. And if you put it out in the universe, the universe also takes care of it. But if we overthink everything, never gonna happen. Never gonna happen. It's like, oh, Astha talks about love and relationships, so I should not do a podcast about love and relationships. Go ahead and do it. Maybe your opinion is very different from mine and will be very different. Will have a very different audience. So just don't overthink anything and just do what you want.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Sorry, folks, my internet kicked me out. Sorry, I'm back now.
No, that's all right, Nikesh. I was just actually saying thank you to Aastha and Mita and you for coming on this panel and for this amazing conversation that we had.
No, our pleasure. And please convey my regards to Tara as well. I love that woman. She's worked so hard for the writing community in India. And, thanks for having us on. Really appreciate it. And thank you for your excellent anchoring. And, and thank you to the fellow panelists. You're just incredible people. I admire a lot. So amazing opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye.
Bye.